A reminder that prophets claim that the word of the Lord came to me, and we've already had a preliminary discussion about how that might happen before we started the recording. They often engage in symbolic activities to underline their words, and Hosea is a really graphic example of that in terms of actions he takes that symbolize his message. Woe to you, you may find that in some of their oracles, and adherence to the covenant of the Lord lies at the root of all the prophets say, and that's also especially evident in the book of Hosea. We talked about forthtelling, speaking to the present situation, and foretelling, looking into the future. So have those two things in mind as we go through. And particularly today, the question of how the justice of God relates to the mercy of God, where we find words of judgment and punishment. Do we also find words of compassion and hope? And how do we balance those two? Hosea lived in the northern kingdom. Amos and Hosea are the only two northern guys that we're going to deal with, because soon after the time of Hosea, the northern kingdom was captured by the Assyrians, conquered by the Assyrians, and their rulers at least were taken away into Assyria. So there are no more northern kingdom prophets. He was active actually from a young man through to an old man, so thus justifying my angry old man comment before we started. 6 decades, it's estimated, that he was active from the reign of Jeroboam II to the time of Hosea. He reflects an awareness of the war between Syria and Ephraim, which was a northern tribe. That's in chapter 5 of his oracles. There's also references to that in the middle section of 2 Kings. But Hosea does not seem to indicate knowledge of the defeat of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, and that's dated to the year 721 before the Common Era in our terminology. So that's why they think the thought is that he had died before then. The name Hosea means salvation. And oracles in this book do provide glimpses of the salvation that God is offering to the people of Israel. But there is also a fair bit of condemnation of Israel for his sins. He is a prophet after all. So we're going to look at both those elements, oracles of judgment and oracles of hope and promise, the salvation that is in view. And that's the first clue, Ian, as to how Hosea might relate to Christian people. His very name is talking about salvation, God's salvation. But how does that come about? I guess that's the question. We're going to revisit our friends again from the Bible Project to get their take on the book of Hosea.
The book of the prophet Hosea. Hosea lived in the northern kingdom of Israel, which he sometimes calls Ephraim or Jacob, about 200 years after they had broken off from southern Judah. Remember the story from 1 Kings. Hosea was called to speak on God's behalf during the reign of one of Israel's worst kings, Jeroboam II. The nation was descending into chaos, and in the year 722, the big bad Assyrian Empire swooped in and decimated Israel. Again, see the story in 2 Kings. And Hosea had seen all of this coming. The book is a collection of some 25 years of his preaching and writing. It's almost all poetry. And this whole collection has been designed to have 3 main sections. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it works. The opening part tells the story of Hosea's broken marriage to a woman named Gomer, who commits adultery. Now, it's not totally clear whether Gomer slept around with other men before or only after they got married, but they did have 3 children together and things fell apart. The important point is that God tells Hosea that despite Gomer's unfaithfulness, he is to go find her, to pay off her debts to her lovers, and to commit his love and faithfulness to her once again. And then God says that all of this, the broken and repaired marriage, the children, it's all a prophetic symbol, telling the story of God's relationship to Israel. So God has been like a faithful husband to Israel. He rescued them out of slavery. He brought them to Mount Sinai, where he entered into a covenant with them. He asked them to be faithful to him alone. But then he brought Israel into the promised land, and they took all the abundance that he gave them, and they dedicated it to the worship of the Canaanite god Baal. And so God has a legitimate reason. He could end the covenant and divorce Israel, and he thinks about doing so, but instead, he says that he's going to pursue Israel again again and renew his covenant with them. And he says why. It's purely because of his own love, compassion, and faithfulness. Hosea then spells out what all this means. He says the consequences for Israel's rebellion will be imminent defeat by other nations and exile. But there's hope for future restoration. One day Israel will once again repent and come back to worship their God. And Hosea says he will place over them a new messianic king from the line of David who will bring God's blessing. And so this opening section introduces all the main ideas of the book. Israel has rebelled, and God's going to bring severe consequences, but God's own covenant love and mercy are more powerful than Israel's sin. And so in the remaining sections of the book, Hosea's poetry explores these themes in more depth. So there are two collections of his accusations and warnings for Israel, and then each of these is concluded by a very hopeful poem about God's mercy and hope for the future. So chapters 4 through 10, Hosea explores the causes and effects of Israel's unfaithfulness. He says numerous times that Israel lacks all knowledge or understanding of God. The Hebrew word to know, which is yada, it's more than just intellectual activity. It describes personal relational knowledge. It's the difference between just knowing about someone and then actually knowing that someone. And God wants Israel to know him like that, in a relationship. He wants them to experience his love for them and become the kind of knowledge that transforms their hearts and lives so that they love him in return. And so this is why Hosea is constantly exposing the hypocrisy of Israel's worship. He constantly shows how they're breaking the Ten Commandments, how they're allowing grave injustice in their communities, and then they go to their sacred temples and they offer sacrifices to God like everything is just fine. But it's not fine. And not only because of their hypocrisy, but because they're worshiping all of these other gods too. He mentions many times their altars to Baal at the cities of Bethel and Gilgal. And not only have they given their allegiance to other gods, Hosea repeatedly accuses Israel for trusting in their political alliances with Egypt and Assyria. So instead of trusting God to protect them, they want to become like these nations and rely solely on military power. And God says it's all going to come crashing down on their heads, because in not too long, Assyria will turn on them and come to ravage their lands. In this other section of warning, Hosea gives an ancient Israelite history lesson to show how this family's been unfaithful from the beginning. So he alludes to the patriarch Jacob's lying and treachery. Remember Genesis 27 and 28. He alludes to Israel's rebellion in the wilderness. Remember the book of Numbers. He alludes to their appointment of the corrupt king Saul, who led the people into sin and disaster. Remember the stories in 1 Samuel. This is all Hosea's way of saying some things in this family never change. So what hope does Hosea have? Well, we know from chapter 3 that God's going to do something to save and restore his people. And that's what these two concluding chapters explore. Chapter 11 is beautiful. The poem depicts God as a loving father who raised his son Israel and then shared everything with him. But the son grew up and rebelled and turned on the father, taking advantage of his generosity. And so in this poem, God is emotionally torn apart. One moment he's angry, and naturally he says he's going to bring severe consequences. But the next moment he's heartbroken. And then he says that he's moved by his mercy and compassion, and he's going to forgive the son that he loves. He says, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? My heart churns inside of me. All my compassion is aroused." And so while God did allow Israel to be conquered by Assyria, face the consequences, that's not God's final word. There's still hope. And that's what the last chapter is about. Hosea calls Israel to repent and turn back to their God, but he knows that it won't last because it never has before. And God says that one day he will heal their waywardness and love them freely. God goes on to describe this new healed Israel as a lush tree that will grow deep roots and broad branches and offer shade and fruit to all of the nations. It's an image of God's promise to Abraham, how Israel was to become a blessing to the nations. And God's saying if that's ever going to happen, it's going to require an act of God's grace and healing power to repair the deep brokenness and sinful selfishness of the human heart, so that God's people can receive his love and love him in return. This is what God promises to do. Now, after this poem concludes, we find the very last words of the book. They're like an appended note. They're likely from the author who collected Hosea's poetry and now wants to speak to you, the reader, for a second. And he says, who is wise and discerning to understand all of this? In other words, Hosea's poems. The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. So the author wants you to know that Hosea's ancient poetry to northern Israel is not locked in the past. It reveals deep truths about God's character and purposes and human nature. And while God should and does bring his justice on human evil, his ultimate purpose, his heart, is to heal and to save his people. And that's what the book of Hosea is all about.
Substitute the name Australia for Ephraim, and he got it in a nutshell.
Right.
It actually reminds me of when I was a boys brigade officer, and I used to tell the kids stories each week, and we were doing some stuff from Hebrew Bible. And one week they said, we sat down and they said, okay, what have the children of Israel done wrong this week?
Okay, well, we're going to think a little bit about those first few chapters that you all recall from the overview have to do with Hosea's personal situation and the challenge that is presented to our sense of morality and the significance of the names.
One of the things that we've talked about as far as the prophets are concerned, there's two things. One is that the prophets frequently live out in some symbolic way the oracles of God. So with the names here, we have Hosea, as John has said, means salvation, and we have Gomer, meaning to complete or bring to an end. And of course, Hosea and Gomer are actually living out in their relationship, the relationship that God says he has with Israel. That is, Israel has been an unfaithful wife. Israel has whored, as the text says, after other gods, or gone after other gods. And we see Hosea in the same situation as God. He's got a wife who's committing adultery with other men in the way Israel commits adultery with other gods. So to actually bring that story home, the children, and names mean a lot in the Hebrew Bible, is going to reflect this story of Israel and God. So the first son they have, Jezreel, means God sows, and it signals a punishment. The next is Lo Ruhama, which means God has no pity, and that signals God's refusal to forgive Israel. And then we have another son, which is Lo Ami, which is you are not my people, and I am not your God, and that seems to seal their fate. So we have Hosea and Gomer's relationship looking like God and Israel's relationship, and the children of this relationship tell the story of how Israel is unfaithful and how God feels about that infidelity. Of course, we know that Hosea keeps going after Gomer and bringing her back, and that's also part of the story of God and Israel. So when Israel goes and worships Baal or other gods, God gets all upset about it, may punish them, but God always comes back to them, even though they have abandoned him. So the names tell a story, and they're really important in this. And fortunately, the text itself actually translates what they mean. It tells you why those names have been chosen for these children. Now, I have a particular interest in Loruhama. God shows no pity. What you're having a look at there is my family tree. And if you have a look up under the column right on the right, and we have Thomas Hawksworth and Loruhama Windle. So I actually had a 6th great-grandmother that was named Loruhama by her mother, whose name was Sarah. Now, we don't know much about her, but I do know that her brothers and sisters were Jonathan, Hannah, Vashti, and Tirzah. And they're all names from the Hebrew Bible. So my ancestor, my 6th great-grandmother, went through life being known as God has no mercy or God has no pity. And because the names are so unusual, this is the late 1700s in Yorkshire in England, I believe she too was telling her story through her children. Tirzah, of course, is the one of the sons of daughters of Zelophehad, one of the few daughters allowed to have land and carry on the land in the family name, and that's in the book of Numbers. And Vashti, of course, is the displaced Persian queen when Esther marries him, and she is put back as, you know, lower wife and banished because she won't do what he wants. So I think she's telling a story here about displacement and about land and about her life in Yorkshire. And we think she probably came from Eastern Europe, from the Pale of Settlement, or if her mother or grandfather came from there. And my DNA with Ancestry shows that I've got this tiny percentage of Jewish DNA from that area. And I'm pretty sure it probably comes from Loruhammer, because I doubt if any Christian person in 1790 in Yorkshire would call their child such a name as Loruhammer, Vashti, or Tirzah. Highly unlikely. Anyway, that's just my little side story for you.
And a side note to that is you can see on the right-hand side that we have found in the records variant spellings of this name, because it's the most unusual name in England. Loru Ama, Loru Hania, Loru Hama, Loru Ham. What we didn't put in there was the one that spelt it Lori Wampa.
Yes, so I actually found 14 variations of Loruhammer on various register certificates and census forms. So people had difficulty grasping with it. Anyway, enough of my family history. You have some questions to ask. What do you make of the series of names of the children of Gomer and Hosea? What story do you think is being told by these names? And how is God acting in this story? And all those questions are in your notes.
We thought you might have, yeah. That's all good, yeah.
Recorded.
It's
So
very
I
easy to
apologise.
do.
I meant to say something, but it doesn't matter.
Well, you can say it now if you wish, because we're going
well-
to just have a quick chat about what we made of those questions. How is God acting? What do you think of the names of the children and what stories being told?
Well, we were just about, at least from my perspective, coming to the view that it's all an allegory, and it's probably the prophet's view, you know, in reflecting on life in the place at the time, and how far the people had actually moved from the covenant agreement that they'd made with God. So this is a pretty good way of indicating to people, well, this is what's going on.
Yes.
Elizabeth, we started our discussion with a question from me, and I wanted to know, to what extent is Hosea actually an historical figure and his family historical figures, or to what extent, as Greg pointed out, they're allegorical?
I think Hosea is probably historical. There probably was a prophet Hosea. He seems to be reasonably accurate in what he's saying for the time in which he's saying it. Whether or not he had this unfaithful wife and these children with these terrible names, that may well be the allegorical part of it, because often the prophets, as we said, metaphorically act out what God is saying through the oracle. So God says Israel's an unfaithful wife, therefore Hosea has an unfaithful wife. So that may well be not historical, but allegorical. But I think Hosea as a person probably was a real person, though we don't know who's writing about him, of course.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting comment. Yeah, who is actually recording this story that Hosea is telling to get a message across that the people are being basically unfaithful?
Yeah.
From, I guess, a feminist perspective, just reading the book, I actually felt a bit cringy, just the way in which Israel is being portrayed as this unfaithful prostitute, and their descriptions to like her breasts and her womb, and I just felt that there was a very strong, as I said in the group, like maybe almost a sexual element. It's as almost as if I remember from doing like geography at uni and stuff, like if in your imagination you feminize the land, then that kind of justifies or legitimizes your harsh treatment. It's easy to rape and pillage, and that sort of stuff continues today. So I just kind of felt that imagery every time like Israel is being described as something bad that we need to take down. It's a woman, but then at some point it becomes the son that we love, and the story of the son.
Right.
It's just an interesting, interesting kind of
Well said.
dichotomy.
Yeah, you're bang on the money, Greg. And if this is not the only place that this happens, when we get to the prophet Ezekiel, in my opinion, it gets worse. But this using women's anatomy and a perceived kind of stereotype of a certain sort of women to describe bad behaviour on the part of Israel is not unknown. I won't say it's common in the Old Testament, but it does occur a few times. And it reflects the patriarchal nature of society. It reflects the way women in some ways were viewed as property. And it reflects a lot of kind of creepy things from a feminist point of view. So I think you're spot on.
And the sad part is that because it's in the Bible and that's the way women were viewed at that time, for some people, that legitimizes current views.
That's right. And people forget to look back at what the culture is. Part of the answer to the question Ian raised before the session is you've got to look at what the culture is. If you think you've been reasonably faithful to your God and you've been living out your life, etc., as a decent Northern Kingdom, and then suddenly you get thumped by a superpower that's on your border, you've got to explain why your powerful God allowed that to happen.
That's right.
So the way you explain it is that obviously God is angry with you. And why would God be angry? Well, let's look at what's going on. Oh, well, hello, there was a group over there that went and sort of offered an offering to Baal. So that must be the reason. God is allowing us to be beaten to pieces by Assyria because we have done the wrong thing. So it's a warlike culture. It's a very different culture from our own. And you need to explain why things happen to you when you're in that culture. I mean, there's no atheists in this culture. They would all believe that Yahweh or Elohim was the powerful God looking after them, and suddenly he's not there, as evidenced by their whipping in war. So how do you explain that? And really that's what Hosea and some of the other prophets are doing. And this, of course, being the Northern Kingdom who went out first, this is one of the oldest prophets we have. So I'm not sure who's writing it. It may have been written up in the exile from oral tradition, but it would be quite an ancient story.
Elizabeth, the whole book raises for me a broader historical question, and that is, has there ever been a righteous nation ever at any point of history, righteous in the biblical sense of being righteous? Ephraim, Israel, obviously wasn't righteous. I guess we could say Australia in this present day probably isn't righteous. Has there ever been a righteous nation? Is it an impossible ideal? Calvin tried in Geneva, and of course that ended up as a dreadful failure. He burnt his opponents at the stake. So are we talking about an impossible ideal here?
I think so. I mean, there's no way you'll ever get every member of a nation unless it's a very small one on an island somewhere and you convert them to some sort of Christian faith and they actually live it out. There are stories that we tell as part of our oral tradition of such islands. But if you're dealing with large, complex groups of population, probably no. No one's going to be living out the ideal of Mishpat or Sedekah. We're going to get to them next week. when we talk about biblical justice and righteousness. It just doesn't happen. And I think this is not so much God punishing people for being unrighteous. This is how you explain why you're being beaten in war. This is what this is about.
And that still happens today, doesn't it?
Yes,
When
it does.
When a Christian nation or something happens in any Christian nation, someone's going to say, oh, well, the reason that happened is because we didn't follow this law, or we weren't obedient to God, or, you know, the Pentagon got raided because of various points of Christian view on things. Nothing under the sun has changed yet.
No, it hasn't. And if God was really looking for this perfectly righteous nation, his eyeballs are probably very tired by now, because it's not going to be, it just doesn't exist. And it has ever been thus. And in the same way, people today try and explain plagues or floods or things as the punishment of God for various things that they devise. The reality is that, you know, nations declare war, bad weather comes, earthquakes happen, and people get hurt. And I don't think we can just say God caused it, even if people seek for an explanation and that's the explanation they arrive at. It raises too many questions about innocent suffering, about what the view of natural disasters are and things like that. And that's a whole other study of theodicy, which I may or may not inflict on you one day, because it happens to be an interest of mine, looking at, you know, why is there evil in the world if there is a loving God? It's a big question.
Exactly.
But what it does tend to do is it says over and over again, Israel or whatever, being a human nation, does the wrong thing and God forgives them and provides them with a second chance. There's always that at the end, the hope stuff. And Jonah is a typical, I don't want to go and do this because I know you're just going to forgive them and I'm going to look like a Charlie.
Well, I think Jonah's actually meant to be funny.
Yes, I'm sure it is.
We don't understand biblical humor, and Jonah's behaving in a way that the ancient Hebrews probably thought was hysterically funny, because he does everything that you don't expect a prophet to do. But yeah.
So what we've been doing, folks, is digging into this question, because we can see that there's a lot of judgment expressed by this prophet, as indeed by other prophets. And there are also elements of hope, because the way that the story continues after the children is that Hosea says that God says to him, the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which can neither be measured nor numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, which was Lo Ami, one of the children, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. So they get a new name. They get a name that signifies their salvation. So, I mean, in thinking about the questions that we've been pondering, the prophet uses as his rhetorical strategy, this is my view, the prophet uses as his rhetorical strategy the judgments, the oracles of judgment again and again. One, to shock the people out of the bad lifestyle that they're living, and two, to remind them that they have signed up to this covenant with this God, and this God has said, if you don't adhere to the covenant, I will punish you. That's in the stories that they've inherited. And therefore, is the purpose of the judgment oracles to evoke repentance, to get the turnaround, to get the complete change in people, which enables then the oracles of hope to come true. That's the tension between judgment and hope that's in this prophet. But I'd like to move us on to a little bit of theoretical consideration. And those of you that have done the Introduction to Old and Introduction to New Testament courses with us in the past will hopefully remember this, these two definitions. A lot of what we do in this course begins with exegesis. That is a Greek word that comes from two Greek words meaning to lead or bring or draw from ago, and then ex meaning out from. So exegesis is to draw out from, to lead out from. And it usually has a primary view to the original context, what was happening there, what's the historical situation, what's the literary structure of the book, what are the important theological themes from that context that we might resonate. When we start to think about the contemporary context, the theoreticians say we're actually moving from exegesis, which is fundamental, to hermeneutics, which is what every preacher, presumably, is doing in their sermons, and what we do, we tap into again and again with the questions in this course that ask, well, how does that relate to us today? Hermeneutics from hermeneuo, a verb coming from the Greek noun hermeneus, which means a translator or an interpreter. So hermeneutics is translating or interpreting with a view to the contemporary context. And just remember, those of you that have done sessions where Elizabeth has taken us through the options that modern English translators have taken when looking at either ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek words. Translation is in itself a process of interpretation. I want to add also as a theoretical input here, something from the Uniting Church's Basis of Union, my favourite paragraph in that document, paragraph 11, which says that the Uniting Church acknowledges God has never left the church without faithful and scholarly interpreters of Scripture, or without those who have reflected deeply upon and acted trustingly in obedience to God's living word. And in the view of Elizabeth and myself, both of those things should go hand by hand. You can't just be a faithful and scholarly interpreter of Scripture without reflecting on and acting trustingly in obedience to God's word, hopefully. But in particular, the Uniting Church enters into the inheritance of literary, historical, and scientific inquiry, which has characterized recent centuries. So that's acknowledging that since what we call the Enlightenment, about 5 centuries ago, there's been a real burgeoning of literary, historical, scientific, sociological, psychological, medical, you name it. There's a whole lot of inquiry that's happened. And we give thanks for the knowledge of God's ways with humanity, which are open to an informed faith. The implication is that as human beings engage in that inquiry, they are actually entering into what God wants us to know about ourselves as human beings and the world we live in. And that should inform our faith. So let's think about some of the passages in Hosea, and this goes to the point that Greg raised, a feminist question, a feminist perspective in approaching it. But the picture for me signals there's been a lot of work done, and the Uniting Church has done a lot of work on the question of domestic violence. What happens if we read this text with the dynamics of domestic violence in mind? On the one hand, I'll strip her naked, expose her, make her like a wilderness, turn her into a parched land, kill her with thirst. It's very violent language. Uncover her shame in the sight of her lovers. I said to her, now listen to the control in this. If this was a man saying this to a woman, we'd be horrified. You must remain as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore. You shall not have intercourse with the man, nor I with you. But on the other hand, in the midst of all of this, the voice of presumably says, I will allure her. I'll bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. So you've got the contrast between the stark violence and the tender, loving invitation. A little bit later, Ephraim has become like a dove, silly and without sense. Now, there's a sexist kind of depiction, there's silly, chattering, flighty women. They call upon Egypt, they go to Assyria. I will cast my net over them, bring them down like birds of the air, and discipline them. Do not rejoice, Israel, you have played the whore. And that's a phrase that appears quite a number of times in this book. You've departed from your God. You've loved a prostitute's pay on all threshing floors. Remember the threshing floors from our Old Testament last year, wisdom stuff last year. There will be no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. And even if they do bring up children, I will bereave them until no one is left. That's a terrible threat. And yet, we have chapter 11, which is a beautiful love poem. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them, I fed them. How can I give you up? How can I hand you over? My heart records within me, my compassion grows warm and tender. So the question now is, what do you think about the view that the God in the book of Hosea is a violent, manipulative, devious tyrant? Reading it with the eyes of what we know about the dynamics of domestic violence. After all, Yahweh, the Lord God, and Israel are in a marriage relationship, a covenant. Hosea is living that out in his relationship with Gomer, whom he accuses of playing the whore. What does that say about God if we view God in this way? That's the easy question for your next discussion group.
Well, how did you go with this about violent, manipulative, devious tyrants?
Before we get into that, I just want to tell you that Jerry came in for a very short time and he's probably trying to make a better connection.
Yeah,
Yes.
I've been emailing him back and forth.
All right, okay.
Yes, we're trying to work with Jerry to get him into the room, but he's been obviously having some difficulties this morning.
Well, he came in for a short time, so that's good. Well done.
Yes. So this violent, manipulative tyrant, anyone got anything to say about that?
So I think, Ray, sorry, I really liked what you said. You said that kind of behavior is very, like, is what you'd expect from from a domestic violence situation. The idea of, you do the abuse and then you try to, call the person back to you, sort of thing. And I thought that was quite apt. But then the conversation moved on to, I was with you that I didn't see love being inconsistent necessarily with punishment. And I used the metaphor, or in my case, I just sort of as a parent punishing a child, just because the child gets punished doesn't mean that the parent loves the child any less. But then there were discussions about, well, is it too harsh and that sort of stuff. But yeah, that's kind of some of the stuff that we talked about in our group.
Yep. And that what you bring to that text is how you'll get a lot out of it. So, there's the cultural context of the text itself and the people of the time. But then as you're reading it, if you're someone coming from a domestic violence situation, you may read that differently, or your view of God. If you have an overall view that God is loving and, or whether you, merciful, you'll read it differently to whether you think God is just a punishing God. So it depends on what you bring to that text as well, I think.
Yes, and what your trigger points are. That's right.
And then I think we were just moving into what Otto was saying, which there's another overlay again, and that is not just the social context, but the cultural context in which the text is being heard. So, there's so many complications come into it when it comes to that fifth paragraph of the basis of union and how we interpret the text in our world.
Yes, that's right. And it's open to abuse if you want to bring your own context and overlay it over the text in the way you said before, Margaret, if you want to use it to enforce, say, the submissiveness of women or see them in a certain way. That's all right, Jerry. We know you've had some issues this morning.
So I just say there's something else in this context that occurs to me. There needs to be, for the people being loved and corrected, there needs to be an acknowledgement by them that they've done wrong. And this to me comes out in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, where there's a prayer that's recited, "We have erred and strayed from your ways like lost sheep."
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that sort of connects with when you're asking, is anyone an ideal nation? Well, no. So that particular prayer should probably apply to all of us in our relationship with God, that acknowledgement that everyone does err at times in different ways. The other thing that's really important to mention in this historical context is we're dealing with an age where there's not heaven and hell.
Yes.
There is no afterlife here for mortal people in the Old Testament. So if God's going to punish you, you will be punished in your life, your mortal life. There's no concept of being punished or rewarded after death, as there is strongly emphasised in the New Testament. So God is a lot more ferocious looking in the Old Testament because of that. It's if God is to punish the nation, he doesn't send them all to hell in an afterlife. He sends Assyria to go thump them. So that is the story that's being told here. And it's really important to remember that context. And when you think of the all-loving God of the New Testament, you need to remember that all-loving God in the New Testament is very happy to stick a whole lot of people into eternal fire. So if you think that's more loving than thumping them in their lifetime in the Old Testament, you probably need to ponder that a little bit further. So we're going to move on to a word that's, I'll get John to put it up on the screen. It's in your handout. It's a Hebrew word. It's pronounced in the Hebrew chesed. I don't expect you to pronounce it like that because it is hard on your tonsils. We'll call it chesed because that's a little bit easier, but it's a hard kind of sound. And it means some interesting things. You'll read it a lot in the Old Testament, and you can see John has put up quite a number of references. It's very common through the Psalms. It appears in all the genres of literature we have, whether it's narratives, the Torah, Psalms, the wisdom literature, the prophets. We get this word hesed. It's hard to get into English. It means a number of different things, and it's translated variously as merciful, as kindness, as steadfast love, as faithfulness, as covenant loyalty, unchanging love, and it's regularly applied to God. And you can see there's a quote from Exodus there, trying to render hesed. We have merciful, gracious, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love. So it's rendering all of those ideas of being faithful, merciful, kindly, constant, loyal, covenant. All of that is bound up in this word. So it's quite an important word in Hebrew, and we see it a lot. And in Hosea, we're seeing it as well, because the words of promise of Hosea speaks can keep this hesed, that God is going to have this faithful love. And it's so faithful that even though God is punishing them, by chapter 11, we have God showing hesed, that, you know, how can I give them up? How can I not love them? I do love them, and I will bring them back to me. So we have this happening in the later chapters of Hosea. So we've got God depicted here in an anthropomorphic like humans, loving Israel as a child, calling to Israel, taking them into his arms, kissing them, feeding them, showing a warm and tender compassion of a parent, withholding anger, welcoming them back, and exuding hesed. So this chapter 11 offers all these wonderful insights into how God deals with people, perhaps after he's done the punishing thing. So we've got some more questions for you to think about. After chapter 11 and all this stuff to do with hesed and kindness and love and care, how do you view God? Do the positives about God and the words of the prophet overcome the negatives, particularly when you think about the context historically we've talked about? And what does it mean for the caricature of the vengeful, violent God of the Old Testament? Is he really that vengeful and violent? What's going on here? So how did you go with that question?
Oh, we couldn't even remember the question. It was so complicated.
Oh, wasn't that bad.
Well, this...
We started off with a couple of us gave our interpretation of how do we view God, and I guess there might have been a consensus that God isn't vengeful. In fact, as I personally think about God, I can't think of any negatives at all. There are no negatives. God is all positive. And that's the great thing about God. Any one of you, if I get into a discussion with you, I'll soon find the negatives. But with God, there are no negatives.
I'm just remembering in Job, there was a comment when his wife came to him and he said, "You have if you're going to take all the blessings, you also have to take the bad as well."
Yeah. Well, and that's actually right. And that is repeated in various places in the Old Testament. It occurs in Isaiah 42, I think it occurs. And it also occurs somewhere in, I'm not sure if it's Judges, but around that era or around that part of the Bible, where it says that good and bad come from God. You get rain, you get drought, you get dark, you get light, you get day, you get night, you get good, you get evil. And if you're truly monotheistic, or you truly believe that your God is the most powerful God and the only God for you, then you believe that all things, good and bad, comes from that God in this ancient world. That's what you believe. Now, we tend not to believe that. And we've got some churches that we have the rise of the figure of the devil or Satan, and he gets all the bad stuff. And that way we can keep God pure and loving. But back in the time Hosea's writing, it wasn't like that. Greg's right. Everything was thought to come from that one God. So that's another thing you need to remember.
Yes, God is
I tend to see the situation in terms of right relationship with God or wrong relationship with God, sin as wrong relationship with God, righteousness as right relationship with God. Hosea wants the Israelites to be in a right relationship with God, and so notions like vengeful, violent, vindictive God are really metaphors for saying, look, you've got to get yourself into a right relationship. You're in a wrong relationship. Get into a right relationship with God.
Yep. Jerry, did you want to say something?
yes. One thing is I notice on God is that he understands every situation in life, or it take a time. He do things, a lot of problems right now. God is saying he's the only God watching all over the world. He's saying all the situations that are happening right now. People say war in some places, sickness in some places, but God he's the only one God watching over everything. Everybody praying, everybody crying. But now it would take a time before God can see and bring the end of this. So he can just sit one place and do it today. He can do it tomorrow. He can do it day after. But he gotta take a time. And it will take a time. Or for example, some people pray for child. They pray for child, and it take a time before God can give them one. So when you pray for child, maybe it will take you something like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years before you can.
You broke up a bit in that, Jerry, but I think we got the gist of it when you were talking about God and prayer and some other things. And of course, with that, you've got to think about why does God answer some prayers and not others? And why do some things happen that seem to be bad things to good people and not others? And that's more complicated when we look at those things. And we were talking about that a little bit earlier before you came into the group. So, but your connection's not good, so we're losing some of your words, just to let you know. I'm sorry about that. Any other comments that people want to make?
I have just a general comment, just all this prophet material. I'm just thinking back at the covenant. my view, I'm just thinking that the covenant was kind of imposed on these people. So like we keep kind of telling people, oh, it's not as if it was a voluntary contract that, people agreed to. It was God saying this is what you need to do. And I kind of just find that, well, if they want to be wicked, let them be wicked. It's like, why are you telling them that they need to do that? Just leave them alone. That's just what keeps coming through my mind the whole time. It's like, why do you keep saying the covenant? Like, it's your covenant. You made them do it.
Yes, and it's an unequal relationship because God, of course, is the superior power in the covenant. There is one exception to what you said. You're right about the covenant with all parts, whether it's Abraham or Noah and Abraham, there's at least 3 different covenants that God pops up and says that. But when it gets to the end of Deuteronomy, Joshua says to the people, this is the covenant. Do you want to keep it? And they all say yes. And he says, if you don't keep it, this is what's going to happen. And he lists some really colourful curses that I am very fond of, about, the dust raining down and the sky becoming like iron and the earth being scorched, etc. And he says to them after that, do you still say you want to keep this covenant? And they say, yes. That's the only time they actually agree that they're going to cross the Jordan and they're going to keep this covenant of God. And of course, Joshua also tells them at the time, I know you won't keep it, even though you're saying you will. I know you won't. So you have to think of, if we've got a God who knows everything and can see, foresee, so they're omniscient, you have to wonder why God bothers when the people clearly aren't going to do what is required.
But the motivation from the people's point of view is that other nations have their armies and they also have their gods and they have their covenants, their arrangements with those gods. So this is the God of our land, of our place, of our people. So if we have a covenant with this, so there's benefits to the people, trying to think from their ancient mind view point of view, their benefits are that this God's going to look after them when they get in the inevitable conflict with other nations. And so what happens in the exile is that God appears not to be looking after them because because their God let them be taken captive. So when further prophets come along and talk about return to the land, which we'll get to in a few weeks, then that's God saying, I didn't give up on you after all. I'm still here. I can do that. Yeah, in their mindset,
But that's only the southern kingdom.
Sorry?
What was that?
That's only the southern kingdom that came back.
That's right. Yes. Well,
yes, that's right.
Well, with the Northern Kingdom, the thinking is that it was the elite group, the upper class group that was taken, and 2 Kings 17 actually talks about them bringing in people from various other places that they'd conquered to inhabit the land, so that the people, the Northern Kingdom people that stayed were intermarried with Kuthites and Hittites and a whole lot of otherites, Hivites and whatever, I can't remember. But they came from other places to the north and the east. And that continued on, and that became the Samaritans. So one reason that the Judeans, the Southerners, were critical of the Samaritans was that they had been infiltrated, if you like, by foreigners, so that the Northerners were no longer faithful to the covenant. They had other gods and other religious practices.
So I ask how present day Jewish theologians explain catastrophes like the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, the expulsion of the Jews from the Holy Land, and then, of course, the Holocaust of World War II. Do they see that as God's punishment for the covenant having been broken?
I don't believe so. I think they probably see that as some really bad people got into a place of power where they could inflict that on a race that was a minority. And I think that's probably the way they view it. Having said that, and having read some Jewish theologians who are also interested in theodicy, that is, why does evil happen to good people? there's some of them like Eli Wiesel, if you read his books, where his character at the end of his book is raising his fist to heaven and saying, you're trying to make me not follow you and you're trying to make me not love you, and it will not work. I will follow your covenant and I will love you despite what you throw at me. And that's what the final word of the character is in that. So there's different viewpoints. So mostly, I think they would say that they're a minority that has been persecuted throughout history, and the Holocaust and things like the Roman destruction of them is part of the persecution of the Jewish people. And it's not coming from God, it's just people like to thump them. And that is why they're so aggressive in modern day Israel. And they feel like they're a very small victim-like state surrounded by hostile nations, and they act accordingly because it's in their DNA.
And the experience that Elizabeth and I had when we were members of the Uniting Church National Dialogue with the Jewish community was that we could happily talk about all manner of issues, including theodicy and all sorts of theological issues. We even had a session, I remember, on the just war theory of Augustine and whether there is such a thing as a just war. That was a really interesting session. But when it came to the land, these people with whom we formed good friendships and who were intelligent, reasoned, well-read, very deeply thoughtful people, they just joined ranks. There was no way they were going to give 1 inch when it came to the land, because to do so would be disaster. The history of the Jewish people showed that if they did not all hold together, they would collapse. So that and I mean, they wouldn't say that they are Zionists, or in fact, one member of the group, when I talked about Zionism, she said, but we're all Zionists, we have to be. But not Zionists in the aggressive political way of a century ago, but Israel must have the land. That's so fundamental to their identity. And so, I mean, my feeling, it's a bit sensitive to say this, but my feeling was at this point, they kind of jumped the shark, that there was no way we were going to be able to have a reasoned discussion about that.
I mean, they did hold different points of view individually. We knew that.
They did, yeah, but that's right.
But they closed ranks when it became public.
So there's the mindset that develops over the decades and centuries and millennia that feeds into contemporary Jewish interpretation and things like this. All right.
Well, just put something in the chat if people want to have a look at it.
So we just to round off today's session, which has had some really major things for us to think about. 2 Kings 15 says, in the days of King Pekah of Israel, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came and captured Ijon, Abel, these are cities, Gilead and Galilee.
And this is a reading you really want to get on Sunday.
All the land of Naphtali. Yeah, I skipped over them. So you can see where Naphtali is to the north, just next to Aram. And he carried the people captive to Assyria. And then about 2 decades later, the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, which in those days was a city. It was the capital of the northern kingdom. And they came to Samaria in the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Halah on the Habor, the river of Gozan, in the city of the Medes. And you can see that up in the top right-hand corner, that there is the first deportation, the purple line by Tiglath, and then the deportation by Shalmaneser, the red line, and then a further deportation by Sargon after the people had been taken right across into the region of the Mede. So 2 Kings reports that, and that brings to an end the northern kingdom as a kingdom of Israel. If you read on in 2 Kings 17, you will get all the stuff about the people that were brought in and the way that they did not follow the law and didn't keep the covenant. And that's the story that Judeans, Southerners, point to explain what went wrong in the north. And of course, as your notes say, the notion that the 10 tribes that were in the northern kingdom there, the whole of that northern kingdom, those 10 tribes were taken away into exile and became known as the lost tribes of Israel. And the Britannica Encyclopedia has a really interesting article that I found on the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And there's various theories about where they went, including, of course, to England.
Which is just a myth, good people. Don't believe it.
So that's the end of our foray up north with Amos and Hosea. So we will be looking now at, so next week's session is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be largely on the idea of justice and righteousness, and Elizabeth's got heaps of material on that. We will look for a little bit at Micah, and the course outline promised information about some of the other minor prophets of this time before the southern kingdom goes into exile. So we'll be looking at justice and righteousness in the prophets as a whole. And if you'd like to read through Micah, again, it's even shorter than Amos or Hosea, and we'll continue to give you that idea of how the prophets are working. And you might like to focus on chapter 6 in that, and we'll be looking at a key section of chapter 6 next week. So that's Micah, a little foretaste of what's to come. Justice next
Yes,
week.
we owe a lot of our notions of justice to the prophets. And of course, Jesus drew pretty much all of his notions of justice from the prophets, particularly the major prophets like Isaiah. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'll just stop the recording before I forget.